Battle of Endor: Return of the Jedi. The galaxy was on the brink of change. For years, the Empire had ruled with an iron fist, stamping out any form of resistance. But now, in a hidden corner of the galaxy, the Rebel Alliance had gathered, preparing for the ultimate confrontation. Their mission: to destroy the Empire's second Death Star, the superweapon that threatened to bring an end to any hope of freedom in the galaxy. The Death Star, under construction above the forest moon of Endor, was the Empire's last and greatest weapon. Darth Vader had promised that it would be fully operational soon, and when it was, the rebellion would have no chance of survival. The time for the Empire's domination had come. But the rebellion was ready to strike back. Inside the rebel fleet, leaders and soldiers were preparing for the most dangerous mission of their lives. The fleet had gathered in secret, poised to launch a multi-pronged attack that would hit the Empire where it hurt most. They had no illusions about the danger they faced. The Death Star's firepower alone could obliterate an entire fleet in a single shot, and the Empire's forces were vast. But this was the rebellion's last chance. They had no choice but to fight, even knowing the odds were slim. At the heart of this mission were a few key individuals, heroes who had fought against the Empire before, and whose courage would be tested more than ever in this final confrontation. Luke Skywalker, the young farm boy turned Jedi Knight, stood on the bridge of a rebel ship, staring out into the vastness of space. The galaxy was both familiar and strange to him now. He had faced the dark forces of the Empire, seen the rise of Darth Vader, and learned the truth about his family. But now, with the Death Star looming, Luke faced a decision that could change the galaxy forever. Should he confront his father, Darth Vader, in the hopes of redeeming him, or should he destroy him to ensure the Empire's defeat? Luke knew his answer, but the weight of that decision pressed heavily on his heart. Vader was his father, and the conflict between their destinies was more complicated than he could explain. But Luke had also seen what the dark side could do, and he was determined to stop it. The Jedi teachings were clear. The dark side would destroy him and the galaxy if he allowed it to take hold. But he couldn't deny the connection he felt to his father. Could there be any good left in him? His thoughts were interrupted by the arrival of Princess Leia Organa, the fierce leader of the rebellion and one of Luke's closest allies. Leia, too, had lost much to the Empire. Her homeworld, Alderaan, had been destroyed by the first Death Star. She was no stranger to sacrifice and had made her share of hard choices. Yet, like Luke, she too wrestled with her emotions. With the rebellion facing its final fight, she knew this could be their last chance for freedom. But she was resolute, knowing the Empire would stop at nothing to crush them. "Luke, the fleet is ready," Leia said as she approached him. "The Death Star is just ahead and the mission is set. We'll have to move quickly once we're in position. The Empire will come after us with everything they've got." Luke turned toward her, his face serious but filled with quiet determination. "I know. We don't have much time. We need to disable the shield generator on the moon's surface, and fast. Without that, the Death Star's defenses will be impenetrable." Leia nodded. "And the space battle? Will the fleet be ready?" "They're ready," Luke said. "Admiral Akbar and his fleet will keep the Empire occupied long enough for us to complete our mission on the ground. The Death Star won't be able to fire while its shield generator is down. That's when we'll strike." Leia paused, her eyes reflecting the weight of the mission. "And after that, we'll finish the job?" Luke hesitated. "Yes. Once the shield is down, we'll hit the Death Star with everything we've got." There was no need to say more. Both of them knew what was at stake. The rebellion's last hope for freedom lay in their hands. The galaxy was at war, and they were about to engage in the most significant battle of their lives. Meanwhile, in the heart of the Empire's forces, Darth Vader stood before Emperor Palpatine, the Dark Master who had manipulated him for so many years. The Emperor was confident. He had overseen the construction of the Death Star, and now he planned to use it to crush the last remnants of the rebellion. "Lord Vader," the Emperor said, his voice smooth and filled with malice. "The time has come. The rebellion believes they can defeat us, but they are mistaken. With the Death Star fully operational, we will bring an end to this foolish war." Vader stood silent, his helmet reflecting the dim light in the Emperor's chamber. He was the Emperor's enforcer, and his loyalty was unquestionable. But in his heart, doubt still lingered. He could feel something shifting inside him, a force he had long denied. It was the memory of the young man who had once been Anakin Skywalker, the Jedi who had fought for justice. The man who had loved and believed in something more than power, the man who had once had a family. The Emperor's voice interrupted his thoughts. "You will not fail me, Lord Vader. You will see the rebels destroyed." Vader bowed slightly, his voice cold as he spoke. "As you wish, my master." The rebel fleet was now close to Endor, its ships taking their positions as they prepared to strike. A sense of anticipation hung in the air. The battle would soon begin, and everything they had fought for would come to a head in this moment. The rebellion had already made its mark on the galaxy. But would they survive the final confrontation? As the fleet made its approach, Luke found himself staring into the endless void of space, preparing for what was to come. The choices he had made had led him to this point. The rebellion, the battle, and the decision of whether or not to face his father. Everything had built to this moment. He wasn't just fighting for the galaxy anymore. He was fighting for his family, for redemption, and for the future of the Force. And so the final chapter of the rebellion's fight against the Empire began. The fate of the galaxy rested in the hands of those who dared to stand against the darkness, had fought for would come to a head in this moment. The rebellion had already made its mark on the galaxy. But would they survive the final confrontation? As the fleet made its approach, Luke found himself staring into the endless void of space, preparing for what was to come. The choices he had made had led him to this point. The rebellion, the battle, and the decision of whether or not to face his father, everything had built to this moment. He wasn't just fighting for the galaxy anymore. He was fighting for his family, for redemption, and for the future of the Force. And so, the final chapter of the rebellion's fight against the Empire began. The fate of the galaxy rested in the hands of those who dared to stand against the darkness. The rebel fleet, a mixture of hope and desperation, moved steadily through the stars toward the forest moon of Endor. The mission was simple in concept: destroy the shield generator on Endor to allow rebel starfighters to destroy the Empire's second Death Star. But the stakes were unimaginable. The fate of the galaxy was hanging by a thread, and the pressure weighed heavily on everyone involved. Inside the rebel command ship, Leia Organa stood with Admiral Akbar, overseeing the fleet's final preparations. There were no more choices to make, no more plans to adjust. It was time to strike. They had no idea what awaited them on the surface of Endor or how the Empire would react, but they had to trust that their strategy would succeed. Leia glanced over at the other officers, standing near the command center. Their faces, like hers, were a mixture of determination and anxiety. The last few hours had been a blur of final checks and last-minute adjustments. They were preparing for a battle they knew would be fierce, but they had to take the chance. The Death Star was ready, and the Emperor's fleet was waiting. If they didn't act now, they might never get another opportunity. "Admiral, do you have a report on the fleet's readiness?" Leia asked, her voice calm but her mind racing. Akbar, his usually composed expression now tinged with concern, nodded. "All ships are ready, Your Highness. The fleet is positioned for maximum impact. Once the shield is down, we will be able to launch a full assault on the Death Star." Leia's eyes narrowed, focusing on the tactical display in front of them. "And the forces on the ground? General Solo and his team will be dispatched to Endor. They're the first wave, followed by a contingent of rebel ground forces. They'll infiltrate the shield generator and disable it. We'll give them cover." Leia nodded slowly, watching as the various components of their plan fell into place. Han Solo had been instrumental in getting the rebellion to this point, and now he would once again be at the forefront of the battle. She trusted him completely, though she could never shake the worry that this mission could be their last. We'll need more than luck to pull this off, Leia muttered, as if speaking to herself. We've survived before, Akbar said, and we will survive again. Leia turned back to face him. I hope you're right. If this is our last chance, we'll give everything we have. Meanwhile, on the Millennium Falcon, Han Solo and Chewbacca were making final preparations to leave the fleet. Han's fingers ran over the controls of the Falcon, his eyes scanning the ship's systems, checking and rechecking everything. He wasn't the type to leave anything to chance, especially not when the stakes were this high. Chewbacca let out a low growl as he worked on the engine's final adjustments, his large hands flying over the controls with a speed and precision that only a Wookiee could manage. Han gave him a quick nod of appreciation. There was no one else he'd rather have by his side in a fight. Han's mind wasn't entirely on the ship, though. He found himself thinking about Leia. He had always known she was strong, but in moments like these he was constantly amazed by her leadership and composure. They had been through so much together, fighting in space, surviving the battles on Hoth, and dealing with the loss of their comrades. The uncertainty of what was to come weighed on him more now than ever. Chewie, how do you think this is going to end? Han muttered under his breath, half to himself and half to his co-pilot. Chewbacca growled softly in reply, the Wookiee's voice full of a quiet understanding. Yeah, I thought so, Han said with a wry smile. But you know, we're not done, yet. There's still a lot to do. As they prepared to leave, Han couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger was at play. The Empire had the Death Star, the most destructive weapon ever created. But this time, the Rebellion had the element of surprise. They had a chance, maybe the last chance to stop the Empire once and for all. But as much as Han believed in their cause, he knew better than to assume anything was certain. The Empire was powerful, and their fleet was massive. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and facing the most dangerous mission of their lives. And yet here they were, fighting against all odds. Luke Skywalker, meanwhile, sat alone in the quiet of his ship, preparing for his own journey to the surface of Endor. His X-Wing was one of the last ships in the fleet, and the rebel forces were counting on him in ways he hadn't yet come to terms with. His connection to the Force was stronger than ever, but the mission was personal, and that weighed heavily on him. He hadn't told Leia, Han, or anyone else about his true purpose. His mission wasn't just to disable the shield generator, or help the rebellion win this battle. He had come to Endor to confront his father, Darth Vader, and face the Emperor. The decisions he would make in the coming days could decide the fate of the galaxy, and more importantly, his own future. Luke knew what he had to do, but he couldn't push aside the doubts in his mind. Was there still a chance to redeem his father, to save him from the dark side? Or had that chance passed forever? He thought of the moments he'd spent with Vader, his sense of anger, the darkness that clouded his soul. And yet, there had always been something there. Something human. Something that made Luke believe it was possible to bring him back. The Force whispered to him, guiding him, but the struggle inside his heart was real. He could feel the Emperor's presence, like a shadow that threatened to engulf everything. The Emperor's manipulation of his father had been powerful, and Luke knew he had to face it head-on. The voices of his mentors, Obi-Wan Kenobi and Yoda, echoed in his mind, reminding him of his training. Trust in the Force, they had always told him. But this time Luke wasn't just trusting the Force. He was trusting himself, his own convictions, and the belief that redemption was possible, even for someone like his father. The journey to Endor was more than just a battle. It was the culmination of Luke's path as a Jedi. It was a test of everything he had learned, everything he had fought for. He was no longer just the farm boy from Tatooine. He was a Jedi Knight, standing on the precipice of the greatest challenge of his life. As the rebel fleet prepared to descend to Endor, the tension was palpable. Every rebel in the fleet knew that this was a make-or-break moment for their cause. For Luke, this battle was more than just a mission. It was a chance for peace, for healing, and for hope in a galaxy that had been torn apart by war. The descent to Endor was smooth, but the tension was thick. As the rebel transport ships broke through the atmosphere, and neared the forest moon's surface, the weight of the upcoming mission began to settle over the crew. Leia, Han, and Chewbacca were on one transport, heading straight for the Imperial shield generator that kept the second Death Star safe from Rebel attack. Luke was with another squadron, preparing to confront the truth of his destiny. The battlefield was already set in space, but the heart of the war was about to play out on the surface of Endor. Leia stood at the front of the transport, looking out the viewport as Endor's dense forests came into view. The moon's thick. Trees and hidden valleys were both a challenge and a weapon. The rebels would have to use the cover of the trees and the wilderness to infiltrate the heavily guarded shield generator facility. It would not be easy, and the stakes were incredibly high. If they failed, the Death Star would be fully operational, and all their efforts would have been in vain. "We're almost there," Leia said quietly, turning to Han, who sat behind her, checking his blaster and the ship's controls. "Don't worry, Princess. We've been through worse," Han said with his usual cocky grin. But Leia could see the hint of concern in his eyes. He was worried, too. Chewbacca growled softly, perhaps sensing the tension in the air. His large form shifted uncomfortably in the cramped transport, and Leia placed a reassuring hand on his arm. "Chewie's right," Leia said, her voice steady despite the swirling chaos of her thoughts. "We've come this far. We're not stopping now." As the transport broke through the clouds, the shield generator complex came into view. A series of Imperial structures dotted the landscape, surrounded by thick towering trees and an eerie silence. The generator was heavily guarded by Imperial stormtroopers, ATSTs, and other defense systems. The rebels would have to fight their way in, sabotage the generator, and escape before the Empire's reinforcements arrived. Every minute counted. "We've got a small window," Han muttered as he studied the incoming data on the transport's console. "The Empire won't be happy to see us." Leia nodded. "We'll have to make it count." The transport landed, smoothly amidst the towering trees of Endor, its doors opening with a hiss. The rebel team swiftly disembarked, ready for the fight ahead. Han, Leia, Chewbacca, and the rest of their team quickly readied their blasters and began to move toward the shield generator facility. It was critical that they stay hidden, and their best advantage was the dense forest surrounding them. "Stay low and move fast," Han ordered. "We can't afford to get caught out in the open." The small team advanced through the thick woods, using the cover of the trees to hide their movements. The air was thick with tension, and the quiet was almost oppressive. The only sounds were the occasional rustling of leaves and the distant hum of Imperial machines. Despite the calm, Leia could feel the rising anticipation in the pit of her stomach. She knew the battle was coming. The question was, when? At the Imperial shield generator facility, the atmosphere was tense but routine. The Empire's forces were confident. They had already defeated the rebel forces at Hoth, and they knew they were only moments away from completing the Death Star. Victory was all but assured. The stormtroopers stationed at the facility were well trained and alert, but they hadn't anticipated the attack from the forest. As the rebel team moved closer, they knew they had to strike before the facility's alarms were raised. "Now," Leia whispered as she motioned to Han and Chewbacca. They were close, so close that they could hear the Imperial troops moving inside the facility. The stormtroopers were focused on their patrols, unaware of the rebels' presence. With a swift signal, Han and Leia broke through the dense trees and opened fire, taking out the first two stormtroopers in the entrance. Chewbacca's mighty roar echoed as he charged forward, knocking down another trooper. The element of surprise worked in their favor. Within moments, the rebels stormed the facility, cutting through the remaining guards. The shield generator was in sight, a massive structure surrounded by stormtroopers, TIE fighter hangars, and turrets. The facility was vital to the death Star's defense, but now it was the key to the rebellion's last hope. Han and Leia led the charge, blasting their way through the complex's defenses. The generator room was just ahead, but the Imperial forces were beginning to react. More stormtroopers, along with the dreaded ATSTs, were coming in force. The rebels needed to destroy the shield generator before the Empire could send reinforcements. "Chewie, give us cover!" Han yelled, firing his blaster at a squad of stormtroopers that emerged from a nearby hallway. Chewbacca roared and charged into the fray, taking down several stormtroopers with quick, powerful swings of his bowcaster. His ferocity was unmatched, and it gave the rebels the advantage they needed to reach the control room. Leia led the charge into the generator's control room, her blaster flashing as she took out the remaining guards. The room was filled with machines and glowing panels, but the central objective was clear. They needed to destroy the generator. Han took point, setting the explosive charges on the central controls. "This should do the trick," Han said, glancing around the room. "Let's get out of here." Leia nodded, but just as they were about to make their way out, the alarms began to blare. Imperial reinforcements were on their way, and it wouldn't be long before the facility was overrun. The rebels had to escape, and quickly. "Go! Go!" Han shouted as he grabbed Leia and pulled her toward the exit. The team moved as quickly as they could, blasting their way through the remaining Imperial troops. The sounds of explosions and blaster fire filled the air as they sprinted toward the forest. Meanwhile, Luke Skywalker was not far behind. Having arrived with his own squadron of rebel fighters, he had successfully landed on the moon's surface, close to the shield generator facility. His mission was clear. Once the generator was down, he would take his X-Wing into the sky to assist in the space battle above. But his journey had a deeper purpose. A confrontation with his father, Darth Vader, and the Emperor awaited him. As Luke made his way toward the rebel base camp, he couldn't help but feel the weight of the decision that loomed over him. This was more than a battle for freedom. It was a battle for his family, for his father's redemption. The fight on the ground and the fight in space were not the only battles he would face today. Luke knew that when he faced Vader, everything would change. The ground battle intensified as Imperial reinforcements arrived. The rebels were on the move, but so were the Empire's forces. The shield generator was set to explode, and the rebellion's final assault had begun. Every soldier, every pilot, every leader was doing their part to ensure the Death Star would not rise again. The battle was far from over, and as the rebellion prepared for the space battle above, the ground forces fought fiercely to secure victory. The battle for Endor had reached its peak, and the air above the forest moon was thick with fire. The rebel fleet, led by Admiral Akbar, was engaged in a desperate fight against the Imperial fleet, which had gathered around the second Death Star. The stakes had never been higher. This was the final showdown, and it would determine the fate of the galaxy. As the rebel ships moved into position, a wave of TIE fighters shot past, weaving through the stars like a deadly swarm. The Imperial Star Destroyers loomed large in the distance, their guns aimed at the rebel fleet. Akbar, with his calm and decisive leadership, took charge. "Rebel forces, maintain formation." Akbar's voice came through the comms, steady despite the chaos. "We need to keep the pressure on them. We will take down that Death Star." Luke Skywalker, in his X-Wing fighter, felt the familiar hum of the ship beneath him as he prepared for, the most dangerous mission of his life. He had just come from the surface of Endor, where he had successfully helped disable the shield generator, giving the rebel fleet a chance to make their move. The Death Star was now vulnerable, but that didn't make it any less dangerous. It was heavily protected by the Empire's remaining forces, and the rebel fighters would have to fight through an armada of TIE fighters and Star Destroyers. "Red Leader, we're counting on you to lead the assault on the Death Star," Biggs Darklighter, a fellow rebel pilot, said over the comms. "Don't let us down." Luke's grip tightened on the controls. This wasn't just about the rebellion's survival anymore. This was about the future of the galaxy. The Empire had already destroyed so much. Now it was time to finish what had been started. The destruction of the first Death Star had been a significant blow, but this new superweapon was much more powerful. If the rebels didn't succeed, the galaxy would face an even darker future. The fleet was ready, and the fighters launched into the fray. Luke and his squadron joined the others in a bold assault, weaving through the TIE fighters that swarmed the rebel ships. The battle was chaotic, with blasts lighting up the space around them as rebel and Imperial forces clashed. Every maneuver was a deadly game of cat and mouse, each rebel ship dodging fire from the Empire's relentless onslaught. "Stay sharp. Red 5, warned Biggs as he flew alongside Luke. They're coming at us from every direction. The rebel pilots were outnumbered, but they had one thing the Empire didn't: unity. They fought not for personal gain but for freedom, and their cause had brought them together in a way the Empire's cold machinery could never replicate. Even in the face of overwhelming odds, the rebels fought with everything they had. The tension was palpable as the rebel fleet moved toward the Death Star, their ultimate target. The giant space station loomed ahead, its massive surface covered with turbolasers and shield generators. Luke could feel the pull of destiny. The fight that would shape the future of the galaxy was about to begin. "Take out the shield generators first," Akbar ordered over the comms. "Once they're down, we make our move on the reactor core." Luke's X-Wing soared through the space around the Death Star, dodging incoming fire as he made his way toward one of the shield generators. His targeting system locked on, and he fired, hitting the generator with a precision blast that sent it spinning into chaos. He glanced behind him to see Biggs follow suit, destroying another generator. The shield around the Death Star was weakening. "Nice shot, Red 5, Biggs said with a grin. Luke didn't respond. He had one goal in mind. He had to ensure that the rebels had enough time to finish their mission. The fleet was still engaged with the Empire's forces, but the rebel ships were steadily making their way closer to the Death Star. If they could disable the remaining defenses, the rebels would have a clear shot at the reactor core. As Luke and his fellow pilots continued their assault on the Death Star, the full scope of the battle began to unfold. The rebel fleet, though outnumbered, was pressing forward, determined to finish what they had started. But the Empire had prepared for this attack, and their fleet was still a powerful threat. Luke's X-Wing was hit by a blast from a nearby TIE fighter, and his ship rocked violently. He fought to regain control, his hands shaking on the controls. The TIE fighter, relentless in its pursuit, locked onto Luke's ship, but Biggs swooped in, taking down the enemy fighter before it could fire again. "You all right, Red 5? Biggs called over the comms. "I'm fine," Luke said, gritting his teeth. "Just a little more to go." The battle raged on as rebel fighters made their way toward the Death Star's core. Every ship, every pilot, was giving their all. The space battle above Endor was reaching its climax, and every move mattered. Meanwhile, on the Death Star's surface, Darth Vader watched the battle unfold from his command ship. His presence loomed over the Imperial forces, a reminder of the power of the dark side. He stood in the shadows of the bridge, silently observing as the rebels continued their assault. He knew that the Death Star's defenses were faltering, but he was also aware of what was at stake. The Emperor, with his manipulative ways, had made it clear the Death Star's destruction would be a crushing blow to the Empire's power. But Vader had a plan of his own. He had been watching his son, Luke, and he knew that this moment, this battle, would determine everything. If Luke could be turned to the dark side, the rebellion would be crushed, and the Emperor's hold on the galaxy would be absolute. But if Luke resisted, Vader's own fate would be sealed. Vader's thoughts were interrupted by the arrival of an Imperial officer. "Lord Vader," the officer said, bowing. "The rebels have breached the Death Star's defenses. The shield generators are down, and they're heading for the core." Vader's eyes narrowed behind his mask. "Prepare my ship. I will join the battle." The time had come to confront his son. Vader was prepared to do whatever it took to ensure the Empire's victory, even if it meant sacrificing everything. The question remained, would Luke join him, or would he fall to the rebel forces? As the rebel fleet closed in on the Death Star, the space battle reached its most critical moment. Rebel ships darted and dived, narrowly avoiding Imperial fire. Every explosion was a reminder of the cost of this battle. But the rebels pushed forward, determined to strike the final blow. Luke's targeting system locked onto the Death Star's main reactor core. He had made it this far. This was the moment that would determine the fate of the galaxy. He fired his proton torpedoes, and they hurtled toward the Death Star, guided by the Force. Time seemed to slow as the torpedoes struck their target. The explosion was massive, lighting up the space around the Death Star as the energy of the reactor core detonated. The massive space station began to implode, its destruction marking the end of the Empire's reign of terror. "We did it," Biggs shouted through the comms. But Luke knew that the battle was far from over. The Death Star had been destroyed, but the Empire still had forces to fight. The rebels still had to finish the job. But for the moment, they had won a victory that would change the galaxy forever. As the rebel fleet fought above, the true battle for the galaxy raged on in the shadows. Luke Skywalker, though part of the attack against the Death Star, had not forgotten the true reason he had come to Endor: to confront his father, Darth Vader, and to face the Emperor himself. The time for battle had arrived, but the stakes were higher than ever. It wasn't just about saving the galaxy anymore. It was about redemption and the future of the Force. Luke's X-Wing had landed on the surface of Endor, and his next move was clear: to make his way to the heart of the Empire's power, to confront the very man who had once been his father. The rebel forces had succeeded in disabling the shield generator, but Luke's mission went beyond victory in battle. He had to face his father, the man who had become Darth Vader, and who now served the Emperor. But could his father still be saved? Luke had spent years training to be a Jedi Knight, learning from Obi-Wan Kenobi and Yoda. But now, the most difficult lesson lay ahead of him. As he walked through the dense forest of Endor, Luke couldn't help but feel a mix of fear, determination, and sorrow. The path ahead was uncertain. His father had been consumed by the dark side of the Force for so long. Was it possible to pull him back? Or was the darkness too strong, too ingrained in him? And what of the Emperor? Would he be able to turn Luke to the dark side? Luke arrived at a clearing where an Imperial shuttle awaited. There was no turning back now. He took a deep breath and boarded the shuttle, his mind focused. The shuttle took off, rising above the moon's surface, and made its way toward the looming shape of the Death Star. The fate of the galaxy, and of his family, rested on this confrontation. Inside the Death Star, Emperor Palpatine sat in the command center, observing the destruction that had begun to unfold. He had foreseen the rebel attack and had anticipated their arrival, but he was calm. His power was absolute. He knew the rebels would be crushed, just as he had predicted. But what he had not anticipated was the potential of Luke Skywalker. The Emperor had long known that Luke was strong with the Force and that power could be his downfall or his salvation. Palpatine had watched the boy grow, watched him struggle with the balance between light and dark. He had been patient. It was clear to him that Luke was the key to his ultimate plan. If Luke could be turned to the dark side, then the rebellion would fall and the galaxy would belong to him. "You are wise to come here, young Skywalker," the Emperor's voice echoed in Luke's mind as he entered the chamber. The cold presence of the Emperor, as dark as the depths of space, filled the room. "It is your destiny to join me. The rebel forces are no match for us. The Death Star is nearly complete, and with its power we will crush all resistance." Luke stood tall, his lightsaber hanging at his side. He had made up his mind. There was no turning back, and he would face his destiny head-on. "No," Luke said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I will not join you. I've come to stop you. I've come to save my father." The Emperor chuckled, his dark eyes gleaming with malice. "Your father. He is beyond saving. He has embraced the dark side. He is my servant, and he will destroy you if you try to stop me." Luke's heart ached at the mention of his father. The pain of knowing that Darth Vader, the man who had once been Anakin Skywalker, had chosen the path of darkness was unbearable, but he refused to believe that there was no hope left for his father. "No," Luke repeated, his voice filled with conviction. "I can still feel the good in him. There is still a part of him that's human, a part that can be saved." The Emperor's laughter echoed through the chamber. "Foolish boy. You are too weak to understand. Your father belongs to me now. And you will too, once you learn the truth about the power of the dark side." As the Emperor spoke, he reached out with his hands, and the dark side of the Force seemed to pulse around him. The air grew thick with darkness, and Luke felt the pressure of the Force trying to push him down. The Emperor's power was vast, and his manipulation was relentless. But Luke stood firm, focusing on the lessons he had learned from his mentors. "You can't turn me," Luke said, his voice filled with resolve. "I won't become like you." The Emperor's face twisted in anger. "Then you will die, just like the others who have defied me." With a flick of his wrist, the Emperor sent a surge of force lightning crackling toward Luke. The intense energy hit Luke with such force that he was thrown backward, crashing into the wall. Pain seared through his body, but he refused to give. And the Emperor's laughter echoed in his ears, but Luke's determination was stronger than the dark side. "I am a Jedi, like my father before me," Luke said, his voice trembling but filled with the strength of his belief. The Emperor's eyes widened as he realized that Luke would not be so easily broken. He raised his hands, focusing all of his power on the boy before him. The force lightning intensified, shooting toward Luke with deadly force, but Luke fought back, summoning the strength of the force to protect himself. Suddenly, the door to the chamber burst open. Darth Vader entered, his black suit a stark contrast against the glowing walls of the Emperor's chamber. He stood at the doorway, watching his son with cold, calculating eyes. Luke turned to face him, a mixture of hope and fear in his eyes. "Father, please," he whispered. Vader's helmeted head tilted, and for the first time there was a flicker of something. Something deep inside him that stirred. He took a step forward, his breath heavy as the weight of his choices pressed upon him. "You don't have to do this," Luke said, his voice filled with emotion. "There's still good in you. I can feel it," the Emperor's voice echoed, with fury as he turned toward Vader. "No, you must kill him. He is a threat to us both." Vader paused, the room filled with tension as the battle for his soul raged within him. The dark side was strong, but his son's words, his son's belief in him, cut through the darkness like a beacon of light. The Emperor, sensing Vader's hesitation, turned his full wrath on Luke. "You will die!" he screamed, sending another surge of force lightning toward Luke. Vader moved faster than Luke could react. In an instant, Vader's gloved hand shot out, grabbing the Emperor by the throat. With all his strength, he lifted Palpatine off the ground and, for the first time in years, made the choice that would change everything. The moment was swift, and with one final burst of strength, Vader threw the Emperor into the depths of the Death Star's reactor shaft. Luke gasped, disbelief and hope flooding his senses. His father had saved him. The dark side had been overcome. But the battle wasn't over. Vader collapsed beside Luke, his breathing labored. The dark side had almost consumed him completely, but in the end he had made the right choice. He had saved his son, and in doing so, he had redeemed himself. "It's too late for me," Vader said, his voice raspy, his strength fading. Luke knelt beside him, his heart heavy but full of compassion. "No, it's not. You've saved me. You've saved the galaxy." With a final breath, Anakin Skywalker, the man who had once been a Jedi Knight, died, redeemed by his son's love and belief. The fate of the galaxy hung in the balance as the Death Star, the Empire's most fearsome weapon, began to spiral toward its destruction. But even with the Emperor defeated and Darth Vader redeemed, the battle for freedom was far from over. The Rebel fleet was still engaged in the desperate fight against the Imperial forces above Endor. The Death Star's imminent destruction wasn't the end of the war. It was the beginning of the final act of the rebellion's greatest victory. The Rebel fleet began to regroup after the Death Star's shield was disabled. Admiral Akbar took a moment to assess the battlefield. The Imperial fleet was still formidable, and the rebels were greatly outnumbered. The Death Star, though weakened, still had enough firepower to crush the fleet if the Empire's commanders could regain control. The final assault was a dangerous one, but Akbar's confidence in the rebellion's resolve kept his focus steady. "We can't let them regroup," Akbar said firmly. "All ships focus fire on the Star Destroyers. Take them down one by one, we don't have time to waste." The rebel fighters and capital ships pressed the attack, each one moving with precise coordination despite the chaos of the battle. The massive Imperial Star Destroyers loomed in the distance, their turbolasers lighting up the void as they fired at the rebel fleet. TIE fighters swarmed the skies like hornets, cutting through the rebel fighters with deadly accuracy. But the rebels were no longer fighting just to survive. They were fighting to win. Luke Skywalker, now aware of his father's sacrifice, joined the fight with a renewed sense of purpose. The confrontation with the Emperor had been a turning point in his life, but it was only one part of the larger battle. The rebel fighters, though still outnumbered, had to press on. The fate of the galaxy rested in their hands. His X-Wing was now a weapon for justice, and he would use it to finish what had begun with the fall of the first Death Star. Luke's voice came through the comms, steady despite the tension in his chest. Red 5, targeting Star Destroyer, locking onto the shield generator. Copy that, Red 5, came Biggs's voice. We're with you. Let's take them down. The rebel pilots moved with the precision of a well-oiled machine, dodging TIE fighters as they closed in on the Imperial Star Destroyer. Luke's X-Wing darted in and out of the flak as his targeting system locked onto the ship's vulnerable spots. Every blast he fired felt like a step closer to victory, every explosion a small victory in the greater battle for freedom. The rebel fleet moved in a coordinated assault, attacking Imperial targets with everything they had. The Star Destroyers, though powerful, couldn't withstand the rebels' concentrated fire. One by one, the Imperial ships began to fall, their defenses buckling under the pressure. Akbar's voice came through the comms again, his tone filled with determination. Keep pushing. We're almost there. We've got the upper hand. But just as it seemed the rebels were gaining ground, the Death Star fired one last devastating shot from its main reactor. The energy burst tore through the rebel fleet, causing ships to explode in the distance. The blast was enough to send a shockwave through space, and the loss was immediate. Report, Akbar shouted into the comms. Sir, we've lost several ships, but we've still got fighters in the air. The Death Star's power is waning, but it's not done yet, came the response from a tactical officer. The rebels had taken out several Imperial ships, but the Death Star was still a threat. It was on the verge of destruction, but the Empire's forces had not given up. The battle was coming to a head. If the rebels didn't destroy the Death Star now, they would lose their chance forever. Luke's X-Wing shook as a TIE fighter hit its shields. He swerved to avoid another blast, narrowly dodging the Imperial ship's targeting. The space around him was a chaotic swirl of light and debris as the battle raged on. His X-Wing soared toward the heart of the Death Star's defenses, heading for the final blow. Luke's mind was focused. This was it, the moment he had been waiting for, the moment that would end the Empire's reign and bring peace to the galaxy. He had faced Darth Vader, he had faced the Emperor, and now he would face the Death Star. The Death Star that had been the cause of so much destruction, that had killed millions and terrorized the galaxy for far too long. Ahead of him, the final trench of the Death Star opened up, the weak point that would send the station into oblivion. Luke's targeting computer flashed as it locked onto the target. The force surged within him, guiding his hand. He had trained for this moment, and now he was ready. But as he prepared to fire, something unexpected happened. A blast of energy surged from the side, another TIE fighter determined to take him out. Luke was thrown off course, his X-Wing veering to the left, as the enemy fighter locked onto him. The TIE fired, and for a moment everything seemed to blur. The shock of the hit sent Luke spiraling through space, but his training kicked in and he fought to regain control. Red 5, get back in position, Biggs yelled through the comms. You're not done yet. Luke's heart pounded in his chest, but he steadied his ship. He couldn't let this be his last moment. With one last burst of energy, he righted the X-Wing, his targeting system locked once again on the Death Star's exhaust port. I'm going for it, Luke said, determination in his voice. He fired his torpedoes, and the shot was true. The powerful energy of the torpedoes slammed into the Death Star's core. There was a moment of silence, and then the Death Star erupted in a fiery explosion that shook the space around it. The massive space station collapsed into nothingness, its structure falling apart in an instant. The rebellion had done it. They had destroyed the Death Star, and the galaxy was free. Above Endor, the final moments of the space battle played out as Imperial ships crumbled under the rebel assault. The Imperial fleet, though large, could not stand against the coordinated and determined forces of the rebellion. Akbar's voice rang through the comms as the last of the Imperial Star Destroyers fell. We've done it. The Empire's fleet is defeated. The Death Star is destroyed. Cheers erupted from the rebel fleet, their victory ringing through the comms. It was over. The Empire had lost, and the rebels had won. On the surface of Endor, the final battle was winding down as well. The rebels had successfully disabled the shield generator, and with the Death Star's destruction, the Empire's grip on the galaxy had been broken. As the smoke cleared and the battle came to a close, Leia, Han, Chewbacca, and the rest of the team looked up at the sky, watching as the Death Star exploded in a fiery burst of light. The mission was complete. Another one. For the history books, Han said, his voice filled with relief. Leia smiled, her heart light with the weight of their victory. We did it, we're free. Luke, standing nearby, turned toward them. His face was somber, but there was a sense of peace in his eyes. The rebellion had succeeded, but for him, there was still work to be done. He had seen his father's redemption, and the galaxy had been saved, but the work of rebuilding had only just begun. The space around Endor was now silent, the remnants of the Empire's once unstoppable Death Star floating in pieces in the void. The battle was over. The galaxy had been freed from the grasp of tyranny, but it had come at a great cost. Though the rebel forces had triumphed, the war had taken its toll on everyone involved. The long years of conflict had left scars, but the rebellion had proven that hope could endure, even in the darkest of times. Leia Organa stood at the command center of the rebel fleet, her eyes fixed on the space before her. The energy of the battle still lingered in her, but there was also a deep weariness. It was hard to believe they had actually won, that the Empire's reign had come to an end. The victory was hard-earned, and the cost was high. Friends and allies had been lost along the way, and the galaxy had been ravaged by war. Yet amidst the destruction there was hope. Admiral Akbar, Leia said softly, breaking the silence in the room. How are the fleet's survivors? Akbar, his tone as steady as ever, replied. We have lost many, Your Highness. Several ships were destroyed and many brave soldiers gave their lives. But the majority of the fleet has survived. We are safe for now. Leia nodded, taking in the weight of his words. She had lost so many people she cared about over the years, friends, family, comrades in arms. But the Empire had been defeated, and now the galaxy could begin to rebuild. The pain would never fully go away, but the future was brighter than it had been in years. She turned her gaze back to the stars outside. The galaxy was vast, full of worlds, people, and untold possibilities. The Empire had sought to control it all, but in the end, it was the courage of those who refused to bow to fear that had triumphed. The fight was far from over, but the Empire's dark shadow had been lifted. On the forest moon of Endor, the rebels celebrated their hard-earned victory. The Ewoks, the small furry natives of the moon, had played a pivotal role in the battle, helping the rebels infiltrate and destroy the Empire's shield generator. They had been instrumental in the battle, and now they were joining the rebels in their celebration. The air was filled with the sounds of laughter, song, and joyous roars from the Ewoks as they danced around the campfires. Leia and Han walked together, hand in hand, as they made their way through the camp. The sight of the Ewoks dancing around them filled the air with a warmth that seemed to spread across the whole camp. The forest moon, once a symbol of danger and the unknown, was now a place of victory, hope, and new beginnings. Who would have thought that tiny creatures like this could help take down the Empire? Han said with a grin as they watched the Ewoks celebrate. Leia laughed, her eyes sparkling. They may be small, but they have the heart of warriors. We couldn't have done it without them. Han looked at her, his expression softening. It's hard to believe it's finally over. We've fought so long, so hard, but we made it. Leia smiled, squeezing his hand. We made it. Together. As they walked toward the center of the camp, they saw Luke standing nearby, looking up at the sky. His face was thoughtful, as though reflecting on the journey that had brought him here. He had faced his father, redeemed him, and in the process, had helped defeat the Empire. But Luke had not come out of this battle unscathed. He had lost so much, and the burden of his father's legacy weighed heavily on him. Yet there was a peace in his eyes that hadn't been there before. Leia approached Luke, her voice gentle. "Are you all right, Luke?" Luke turned to face her, offering her a small but sincere smile. "I will be. It's strange. Everything has changed, and yet so much is still the same. The war is over, but there is still so much to rebuild. We've won, but the galaxy is broken and we need to heal." Leia nodded, understanding the weight of his words. "We'll rebuild. Together. The rebellion, it's not just an army. It's the people who fought for a better future, and that future starts now." Luke's gaze shifted toward the stars, his thoughts distant. "I've learned a lot. About the Force, about myself, and about my father. The path I've walked, it's not just about fighting the dark side. It's about bringing balance to the Force." Han approached, his usual confidence tempered by the gravity of the moment. "You did what needed to be done, kid. You saved us all. The galaxy's got a lot to thank you for." Luke smiled faintly, but there was sadness in his eyes. "I didn't do it alone. You all fought with me. The rebellion, the Ewoks, everyone. We all played a part in this victory." Leia, Han, and Luke stood together in the quiet of the night, watching the stars above. The battle for the galaxy was over, but their work was just beginning. The Empire had been vanquished, but the struggle for peace and justice was far from over. They knew the road ahead would be long and the scars of war would take time to heal. But there was hope now. Hope that the galaxy could rebuild and thrive once again.